Essential, relevant and authentic content. This is key to understanding the significant mandate and commitment of the South African National Roads Agency. This week, we launch a weekly program to keep you informed about every aspect that makes the national roads infrastructure work for you, no matter where you come from or where you're going. It's all about the road ahead. To initiate this conversation, well, there's no better person than the SANRAL's new CEO. Mr. Demana, thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. This has been a long time coming.
It certainly has been, and so much to talk about. Let's begin, I think, with the history. 25 years. What would you say SANRAL has meant to South Africa in a quarter of a century of work?
Yeah, I think as you rightfully point out, SANRAL is 25 years old this year in April. That's the time that it was formed. And over the years, what the agency has done is really significantly expand the national road network. You look at the network that it manages today. It's 23,500 kilometers. I think when it was formed, it had just less than 10,000. A lot of that has been roads that were transferred from the old roads agencies as well as the national department. And of course, they have built a lot of roads to expand on the existing network. So it has grown phenomenally. And there's still scope certainly to add another 50% to the current size, and that's the mandate that SANRAL has to take it to 35,000 kilometers, but we'll talk about that later.
I think for our viewers, just out of interest, if you could position us in terms of our road network when we compare to the rest of the world, how are we doing as a country?
Yes, I think I learned with a lot of surprise that our national road network in South Africa is about 750,000 kilometers, even though just 21% of that is paved and the majority will be gravel roads. In total, we are 10th longest in the world, and we also have the 19th longest paved network. That's the tar roads, if you like, or the surfaced roads. So it is a sizable network. If you look at what the road network does, for SANRAL, we manage just under 4% of that 750,000. But it is a very important and strategic as well as primary network, because it carries 38% rather, of all annual vehicle kilometers. That 4% carries 38%. But it also carries 70% of freight logistics in the country. So it is a very small but strategic and primary network.
All right, and I, just before we start getting into the current situation, I think also we underestimate sometimes, because as citizens, we are literally just going from point A to point B. But in terms of the country's economy, the work that you do and the agency does is critical.
Yes, certainly. And you will often hear the Minister of Transport, Ms. Chikunga, will say, the work we do in transport is we carry the economy. This is the economy in motion. And when you see trucks, roads, buses moving, that's literally the economy moving. And we think that roads really are a critical factor that drives economic development. And behind all that is SANRAL.
All right, let's talk now about the present. And I'm sure that over time the business has changed a little bit, but what business are you in? What do you do at SANRAL?
Actually, the business hasn't changed. It's a very simple business model. We design and plan roads. We then construct them, maintain them and rehabilitate them when it's due to be rehabilitated or to be renewed and all of that. It has stayed constant over the years. Of course, we are also responsible for financing all these activities. So the mandate has remained the same. The one thing about SANRAL is it's almost like a permanent public-private partnership model, because whilst we are responsible for the asset management and the capital allocation and the decisions around which roads must be developed, when and how, the execution is led by the private sector. We run tenders to then get private sector to be the execution end of it. But the overall planning, the coordination, the decision around capital, where things must be developed, how and when, we are responsible. We are responsible for that. On behalf of the Department of Transport, it's 100% owned by government, so it is a state-owned agency.
All right, so we're going to do a deep dive just now, but overall, what would you say is the state of the business today?
I'm very lucky, if I have to say that. I've joined SANRAL this year from 1 January on the back of a major announcement by the Minister of Finance during the medium-term budget policy statement, where he has announced that government will take over the e-toll debt responsibilities. That's in the order of 43 billion rand, and that between the national government as well as Gauteng provincial government, they will settle the debt. That has been a huge relief for me as well as for those that I found at SANRAL. What it does is that it gives us a platform not to worry about e-toll and the debt and collection of debt. It gives us a platform to really just focus on accelerated development of roads and rollout of expansion roads, maintenance, as well as greenfield roads that we are looking at. So financially, a very healthy position. Secondly, I think we've also fortunate in that the National Treasury and the Department of Transport have consistently shown that they want to support SANRAL financially with increasing grants. Our grants are now in the order of 25 to 30 billion. And those allocations over the medium-term allocation is in the order of around 90 billion. So lots of state support in funding, and of course relief that the toll debt will be taken care of.
All right, let's talk a little bit about, because when you talk about Treasury supporting the agency and making sure that it stays afloat, people start thinking about Eskom, Denel, and other state-owned enterprises, SAA. Are we in the same league here where you're going to be bailed out continually, or is this a different scenario?
And I think rightfully so, people would be concerned about the health of state-owned entities in general. But SANRAL is in a very good position. Once you talk about the e-toll debt being taken care of, our balance sheet really will be de-geared, so we wouldn't have any debt currently, absent that. So we have the capacity to go to the bond markets, we have the capacity to go to the banks and to borrow in order to expand on our capital projects. Our toll roads are able to fund themselves and future expansions without having to rely on grants. In other words, the conventional toll roads have 100% compliance and they generate enough revenues to cover all those operations on any given day. On the non-toll side, we are also in a very fortunate position. We have been recipients of grants to fund the roads, to maintain the roads and build new roads. The good thing about Sandrels is its efficiency. For every 1 rand that we get, we estimate that 85% goes back into the road. So the level of overheads, salaries, wages, and consulting and administration costs has been kept very low over the years by my predecessors. And I think that's the good thing. We've had over 15 years of clean audits, so symbolizing that there's strong financial management and governance in the organization. So I don't think South Africans should be worried about another potential collapse.
All right. So are we saying that when the Auditor General says that she was concerned about SANRAL's going concern status, given the credit loss over the e-toll, how do you comfort us when we hear an Auditor General saying things like that?
I think as an auditor, that's a very responsible thing to say and to raise, because without government coming out strongly and indicating how they were going to support SANRAL on the e-toll side, it is a material risk. However, government has pronounced very clearly that it will take care of that debt. So the going concern issues do go away. But secondly, one must also indicate that government has never allowed SANRAL to default. Even when it was not collecting enough revenues for the toll, government allowed that we could reallocate funds from the non-toll portfolio to cover the shortfalls of e-toll over the years. And so that has always given the Auditor General the comfort that yes, we can see the support, you are able to move money from one portfolio to the other, but nevertheless, this has to be resolved. There must be clarity going forward. Otherwise, you will always have this cloud hanging over you.
You talked about grants, and one issue that we've found out or we've been hearing about is SANRAL underspending on its grant because of procurement processes. I mean, this sounds like own goals that are being scored here.
I'm not going to shy away from that. Yes, it has been a concern that we encountered certain procurement delays. Some of it were aspects outside of our control. Why do I say that? One was that when there was an introduction of 30% allocation for government tenders or SOE tenders to locals, there was an interpretation difference between SANRAL and National Treasury at the time. That took 18 months to resolve. Why that long? I don't know, but it was resolved. Secondly, you will recall that there was a case that was brought by, I think, AfriForum against the Minister of Finance regarding preferential procurement policies. The Concord or Constitutional Court did confirm that the regulations of 2017 were unconstitutional and unlawful and had to be redrafted. So throughout most of 2022, we sat with that uncertainty on how to proceed. It was finally resolved towards the end of 2022, last quarter of 2022 calendar year. Since then, you will be glad to hear that from April to December, we awarded contracts to the tune of 22 billion. But from January, when the board approved a turnaround strategy, to March, we then ramped up by another 29 billion. So overall, last financial year, we did 22 billion awards. The financial year that just ended now in March, we did 51. So, there's been a magnificent turnaround that I'm proud of, and we want to keep that momentum going. So I'll say operationally, we have resolved those issues, and we are also looking at bringing in more people to execute on the pipeline that we have.
All right. Talking about resolving issues, there are some tenders that have been flagged over time. You talk about supporting local. There's this business with Mexa Construction, 4 billion Rand SANRAL bridge contract awarded to a business regarded as defunct. How does that kind of thing happen? And then supporting Chinese business instead of local?
They are not just any ordinary Chinese companies in these joint ventures. You're talking about one of these companies is the number one largest construction company in the world, so billions of dollars of balance sheet. The other one is the seventh largest. So you have a lot of strength, you have a lot of skills and expertise that you are bringing on board in partnership with locals. And the last time we checked, that is not illegal to do in South Africa. We don't design the laws. But there is also a very important aspect that we must acknowledge. The bridges that we want to build. Msikaba is going to be the highest bridge in Africa. It's going to potentially be the second longest cable-stayed bridge in the continent. We are not going to build another bridge like that in 30 years. It's not being planned. I don't know where it will be built. So we don't have the skills locally to do that. It's a fact. So we've had to source the skills, and the skills are here in partnership. The materials and other things, the employment is sourced locally. So there is a lot of localization in these projects that's there. But the important aspect, Peter, is that when you look at the complexity of these projects, and when you look at what the Chinese have done in their own countries, the type of project they build, you can then realize why they would have come out tops in the bidding processes. But the second thing, or potentially the last thing, is that when you are in a JV, there is a majority partner that financially will underwrite the JV. And the Chinese are covering most of the financial risks. The performance bonds and guarantees that we seek in these projects are in place from banks, like local banks. So the risk is covered, the skills is there, the expertise is there. And that's really what it is.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, because you've mentioned one of the things that you do is maintenance. And there are concerns that you are underperforming in terms of maintenance, and again, partly to do with things like delays and procurement processes. Talk to us a little bit about that and how you are overcoming this, because we want to be on good roads. We don't want to be running over potholes and things like this. Talk us through the state of repairs and why have there been some delays?
Yeah, I think certainly one will say, maintenance is also a function of, awarding contracts to get, to get people on the job and to get the maintenance work going. So all of that was affected by the issues of regulatory uncertainty, as well as interpretation of localization. But we have overcome that, signaled by this, as I said, the awards that we have made, 51 billion rand recently, and that momentum is being carried through. For SANRAL, we want to make sure that every single kilometer in our network is covered by a routine road maintenance contractor. They patrol the route regularly, they cover potholes, and they do the necessary maintenance that our asset management system will show that is required. So I don't think we are doing badly. However, what is required is certainly to accelerate certain special maintenance projects that are required. I'll give you an example. R21 towards the airport. It does require a lot of attention and focus. And there are a few other such areas, especially on the toll roads. If you go to N1 towards Musina from Makado, it does require a lot of attention and work on it. We haven't been able to do that because we just didn't have the capital. The reason being, we have a non-toll portfolio funded by our grants and the toll portfolio. So your R21 is in the e-toll portfolio, your N1 is in the toll portfolio. Because we had unresolved funding issues on e-tolls, we were not able to borrow the necessary capital to spend on the toll portfolio. Where are we with that? We are resolving with Treasury the issue of borrowing limits, because as soon as they increase our borrowing limits, we are able to go and use our bond markets, raise money, and then attend to the urgent maintenance issues that are required. That's where I will admit there are issues, but they are related to borrowing limits and not necessarily procurement delays.
Okay, so that's the current state of affairs. What we know is that the rail network collapsed and we've seen more and more trucks on our roads. That means there's more wear and tear on our roads. And then on top of that, you've got climate change effects, weather, extreme weather. Are you able to keep up with the pace of wear and tear on your network to get the maintenance done?
I think firstly, it is the reality that we have to live with as SANRAL. It's not a transitionary issue. It is more of really a permanent reality that there's going to be more trucks, more freight on the roads for the foreseeable future. And I certainly do hope that the work that Transnet is doing in restoring the various lines, the work that PRASA is doing in restoring the various corridors will bear fruit sooner rather than later. Now, in readjusting to this new reality, we have to get more resources. Government, through the Department of Transport and National Treasury, are committed to funding us. That we have seen. Now, with e-tolls just about to be sorted and the debt covered, we are able to again access private sector to raise funding. We should also be able to get development finance institutions like the DBSAs and many others to also fund us for infrastructure development on the toll portfolio, to address maintenance issues, as well as to expand some of these roads to cater for increased traffic. Of course, the other issue is these roads may not necessarily be designed to carry lots of trucks and freight, so safety is an issue. And so most of the enhancements that we are doing also have to address safety aspects, so that you are now able to carry trucks as well as small cars on the same route. On the same route, and you reduce the extent or the severity of the accidents that do take place on the network. One of the challenging things is skills. People are leaving the country, a lot of experienced people, almost close to retirement, engineers, project managers, they are leaving the country. It's a new reality. So we have to train more people. We have to bring in young graduates, engineers, and train them. We also have to tap into the retired pool and bring in mentors, at least in the short period of time, to help us transition so that we build capacity. And I'm very concerned about skills personally in the country and what is required. Obviously, the other thing is when we award more work, the private sector has to also gear up. And as government, we may not necessarily compete with them on the remuneration that they offer. But we think that we have an appealing mandate, we have an exciting organization to work for, and we should be able to attract the necessary skills. But I'm more worried about skills than funding at this point in time going forward.
We'll talk about the future in our next conversation, but perhaps to end this one, if you could help us understand the user pay principle, because we first got to hear about it with the e-tolls, and I just wonder if actually it's a new concept at all, and where does it fit into our normal lives in terms of moving around on the networks?
Yeah. It's not something that was really developed by SANRAL for the e-tolls, but it's always been that taxpayers fund social infrastructure. Of course, some of that funding comes through indirectly through tax, the tax we pay, and some of it is direct, like through the e-toll. I think that, of course, South Africans, when they looked at the e-toll schemes, they may have raised concerns around costs related to the administration of the scheme versus the cost related to funding the amount that went into building the roads. Fair enough. But otherwise, the user-based principle in our conventional toll roads has been accepted for many years. Those toll roads have been operating, and compliance is almost 100%. Everywhere you go, you climb onto a national road, N1, N2, wherever you go, you get to a toll gate, you pay and you move. You make a conscious decision to drive through that or to use an alternative road so that you don't pay the toll. So I think that's, in simple terms, it's something that South Africans are accustomed to. But I guess e-toll was a different animal altogether.
All right, Mr. Demana, we'll leave that for today. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, and we look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you.
Next week, in part 2 of this interview, Mr. Demana unpacks the commitment to realizing the vision of SANRAL. And let me tell you, it's more than just road infrastructure.